Hi, I'm Linda Piccini, and there's nothing more fun than exploring different accessory feet that can make your machine come alive. If you found this video, chances are that you own the Garment Maker's Foot Kit, and in this video, we're going to explore all the feet and give you tips for success, so join me now. The Advanced Driver Set is the perfect tool to reach for whenever you need to remove and exchange a presser foot on your machine because it's able to get into an area that's actually kind of hard to get to. The second screwdriver that comes with the set is the perfect tool to reach for when you need to remove those hard to remove set screws on your needle plate. The short stature of the screwdriver is the reason why it makes it so easy to remove your screws. The clear open-toe foot gives great visibility, especially when you're doing applique. Also on the bottom of it, there's a wide enough channel to let satin stitches glide through smoothly. Let's take it to the machine. We'll just snap the foot on. And I've already set my machine up for a satin stitch. You might find that little red mark on the toe of the foot to be a nice aid for lining your fabric up as well. The open toe area of the foot, along with its clear nature, is what really does help you get things aligned so that your stitching always turns out beautiful. If your pattern calls for some vinyl for a clear window, sewing on your standard foot is a nightmare. This metal will drag and you simply can't get good stitching. This is where having a Teflon foot makes a huge difference. This plastic foot will glide easily over fabrics that would typically stick to metal. Let's take it to the machine. We're going to start by snapping the foot on. And let's just lay our little pocket on the fabric and watch how easily it glides. This kind of little vinyl pocket is the perfect place to put your business card. Border guide foot has a number of markings on it that truly makes the job of getting spacing for decorative stitching really perfected. What I've done here is I've started with putting a crease in my fabric to give me my first line. Let's take this to the machine. To make this foot work well for you, I'm going to be using a piece of fabric that has a foundational piece of stabilizer to begin with. And because I'm using a decorative stitch, I've also chosen a little bit heavier weight of thread to put in my top thread. Now I'm lining this crease here with this front line that is in the center of my foot, and let's just stitch down this line. To keep my fabric square to the stitching, I'm always going to be making sure that I'm matching up my press line with the center of my foot. Now that I've finished my first row of stitching, I'm going to flank either side of this with another stitch. This is where the lines on my foot really come in handy. For this second row, I've chosen a triple stitch and I'm going to be lining up, not watching where I'm stitching, but rather centering this pattern within these two rows of red markings that I have on the toe of my foot. And now because I have the same markings on the other side, all I have to do is swing my fabric over and complete my next row of stitching. As you can see, this makes the job of making the spacing of decorative stitches so much easier than you've ever had before. Make your next project as unique as you, using these different markings on it so that you can create fabric of your own. The invisible zipper foot really does do a perfect job getting your zipper placed exactly where it needs to go. Now, an invisible zipper itself, when it's closed up, really does not show any of the teeth. And to begin with, what I'm going to do is first start by taking an invisible zipper, and I like to press the coil so that it's somewhat flat, and I'm going to do that on both sides. The next thing you want to do is make sure that you've stitched your seam allowance within your fabric. And so I've taken the two pieces of fabric with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance and stitched down it. Now this foot itself, when it's on the machine as you're stitching, has two different channels on the bottom that make guiding the zipper perfect. Let's take this to the machine. So I have my machine set up for a straight stitch center needle position, and when I place this foot on, it has a kind of a universal appeal in that it can work on either side of the zipper. I traditionally like to start with the left-hand side of my zipper, so I'm going to be stitching this side of my zipper onto my fabric. And to do that, I'm going to be taking this part right here close to the teeth and lining it up exactly on that 5/8 of an inch seam allowance line. When I place this under the foot, I'm going to be placing it on the left-hand side channel right here. And then what I like to do is to rotate my hand wheel so that it's actually into the zipper itself. And this is how I'm going to anchor it so that I can begin stitching. Now the best thing to do is to make sure that your stitch length is a little bit longer than usual. And so I'm going to increase it to a 3.5 millimeter stitch length so that if it isn't lined up exactly, it'll be easier to rip out. And now I'm just going to begin slowly stitching. Notice that as I'm stitching, this will curl up a little bit, but I'm always ensuring that I am lining up my teeth so that it's right on the stitching itself. When I get towards the end, I'm just going to get as close as possible to the end. And then what I like to do is just backstitch a few stitches, cut my thread, and now let's take a peek. Once you finish the first side of your zipper, it's a good idea to close it up to make sure that you haven't accidentally stitched through any of the coil. Now is a good time to take your second piece of fabric and line it up where it's going to be stitching. So when you open this up, you'll see that this is the second side of your zipper. And this really helps with orientation of where you're going to place the zipper and what direction it's going to be in. And a really good idea at this point would be to just take a wonder clip or a pin and pinch those layers together so that it's lined up where you want it to go. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to unzip my zipper, and then I can keep my layers together. And now I'm going to flip my zipper over, and now this is the direction that I'm going to be stitching in on the second time. And if I started exactly at the top with my first side, I'll be able to do the exact same thing on the second side, and it will line up. So now let's just introduce this underneath the foot of the machine, and this time I'm going to be lining up the channel so that it's on the right-hand side of the foot itself. Again, I'm going to anchor it and just lift and sew down this side. Get as close as you can. And now let's take a peek at our zipper. Invisible zippers truly give any outfit that you make a professional finish, and it's one of the easiest zippers to put in if you know how to do it. The adjustable bias binder foot allows you to do a decorative finish on the edge of your fabric using contrasting fabric. The beauty of this foot is that it is adjustable and can accommodate all different sizes of pre-finished bias binding. If you want to make your own, you certainly can do that as well. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the anatomy of the foot. Anytime that you see adjustment screws, this means that you get a chance to change the foot's direction to some degree so that your fabric is going to line up exactly where you want it to go. This wheel here will move this little flange in and out so that it perfectly conforms to the bias binding that you have purchased. Let's take this to the machine. This foot actually has its own shank, and so what we're going to start off with first is removing both the foot, and then using the advanced driver, let's remove the screw just enough that we can slide the shank off. If your baby lock machine has a high shank like my machine does here, you'll have to remove this entire shank and then use the included S adapter that came with your machine. This S adapter actually conforms to your bar itself. It simply slides on in place, and you'll reintroduce the screw that you had holding your initial shank. And once in place now, you can place the foot on your machine. And this time you can use the advanced driver to get that snugly positioned. And now let's take a look at this foot. If you look on the toe of this foot, you'll notice that there are incremental markings in millimeters that are running down the side. This particular screw here allows you to move that in and out so that you can accommodate whatever size of fabric strip that you have. I'm also going to be able to make an adjustment once I have this fabric in place, and you'll see that in a moment. I've cut a 45-degree angle in my fabric, and now I'm going to begin introducing this strip of bias into the foot, and it is a little bit easier if you grab a stiletto or something to help ease that fabric through. Now, when you're looking at the side of the foot, you'll notice that this piece of plastic cups around both the bottom and the top piece of the fabric. And as I pull it through, what I'm going to be doing is positioning it so that the fabric is snugly against this inside edge. And then what I want to do is rotate this piece here so that it fits snugly so that my fabric does not move back and forth. All right, so let's get that on the machine now. Now that I've got my binding in place, I'm going to slide the fabric that I'm going to be encasing in between that area here, sandwiched between the fabric, and then I'm going to lower my presser foot. Now the machine itself with this foot is going to guide my fabric. What I'm going to be looking for is where it's stitching, but in order to be able to make adjustments, I first need to see where it's going. So let's just start stitching. Okay, and I can already tell that I'm barely on this, and so what I'm going to do is make an adjustment. I'm going to raise my needle, I'm going to loosen this screw, and I'm going to coax that over towards the foot itself, just a small amount, so that I can get my stitching closer to the edge. Now this bias binder attachment will accommodate binding between 1/4 of an inch wide and 3/4 of an inch. So you can use a lot of pre-purchased binding or you can make your own. So if you're stitching and you notice that your stitching is too close to the edge or if it's just right, you can continue to make adjustments. And I always recommend that what you do is do a test before you actually start stitching on your real project. If you've made as many adjustments as you can, but you still can't get your needle over, turn to your machine's stitch width and move your needle position over until you have it exactly where you want it to go. This adjustable bias binder attachment is the perfect addition to your sewing room, and it does a beautiful job of finishing the raw edges of your fabric. It comes in really handy if you're doing a Hong Kong finish on the inside of garments or putting on a nice edge on placemats or other home decor items. Let's explore the Ruffling Foot and the many features that it has. So to begin with, this foot is a snap-on foot. And the other thing that it has is the ability to wrap around the needle bar, and the movement of the needle going up and down is what actually makes this foot gather fabric, and it can actually pleat it as well. So see how I'm simulating this movement? This area right here on the foot will allow you to take one pleat or one tuck every single stitch. You can also modify it by lifting this and moving it into the second slot so that it will only take one tuck every 6 stitches. This is for every 12 stitches. And lastly, if you just want to simply disengage it for a moment, you won't be taking any pleats at all. Now, as I've mentioned before, on different feet, when you see different screws on it, that means you've got the ability to adjust. And because this foot itself goes on so many different baby lock machines, you might need to make some adjustments. So don't just assume when you take it out of the box that it's going to fit perfectly. Let's head over to the machine and I'll show you what I'm talking about. All right, so let's take a look at this foot before we even put it on the machine. And I've already loosened up this screw and this screw. And as you can see, this screw allows me to move front to back, and this screw will allow me to move this piece side to side, with my goal being that when I have my needle drop, it goes right into the center of this hole. And so the very first time that you put this on your machine, you might want to do, and you'll need to do, the same thing that I'm doing here, which is loosen up those screws. And now let's put this on the machine itself so that you can see the adjustments necessary. I'm going to introduce the foot into the machine, and I'm going to slide this back so that I can position it right over that snap-on bar. And at the same time, what I need to make sure is that my black piece of plastic here is getting looped up and over my needle bar itself. And when I have it in position, it'll just snap in place. Okay, now that I have the foot in place and it's snapped on, what I'm going to do next is I'm going to lower the needle into the machine itself. And what I need to do is make an adjustment so that it can go in without being restricted. And so this is where those screws that I've loosened up will allow me to position the foot either side to side or front to back. So did you notice how I just pulled this piece back here? And now what I'm going to do is drop the needle. And so if I need to, I can loosen that screw so that I've got more play in it and I can get it where I need it to go. And then the other thing that I'm going to do is make sure that I am good side to side. And so again, these are adjustments that are made much easier when you're positioned right over your machine itself. And once you have it positioned, then tighten those screws up. And then what I'm going to do is take a couple hand stitches just to make sure that I'm clearing it. So I'm just going to rotate my hand wheel towards me. Now, as I do that, you can start to see how this ruffling foot works. It's going to grab fabric with these little forked pieces here, and it's going to slide it in, and the depth that it takes is indicated by two different things. The first one being this adjusting screw in the front, and it's also somewhat predicated by the stitch length that I have. And I've got my machine set up with a stitch length of 2.5 millimeters. So I'm going to now just rotate my hand wheel towards me, raise my presser foot slightly, and let's put some fabric in here. Now this also has some nice adjustments for you to be able to slide your fabric in. And so I'm going to begin by just merely taking my fabric and bringing it forward. And so it might get a little snug because those forks are pressed down on the fabric. So I've got my fabric underneath, and now I'm just going to rotate my hand wheel towards me. And did you see how it made its first tuck? Now it's making the second tuck. So what I can do now is slide my fabric. There is a little piece that's here, and I'm going to tuck it underneath, and I'm going to bring it forward. And what this does is it will keep my fabric even all the way down the length of it as I'm ruffling it. And so remember, I'm on every single stitch, I'm taking a tuck. Now this is taking some really deep, generous tucks. Let's rotate this in the opposite direction to make this dive a little bit not as deep, and let's just see how this impacts the stitch. That made it even tighter. So we're going to take this, I'm turning it as far as I can to the right. Okay, rotate my hand wheel towards me. I'm going to raise my presser foot, and let's just pull that fabric out and take a look at it. So that took a very long piece of fabric and really did gather it very tightly. And again, if you don't want it this tight, play around with some of the adjustments on this part of the foot itself, which will impact this. Now that we've done a little bit of gathering, let's run a piece of fabric through where we're only doing one tuck every 6 stitches. And to do that, I'm going to lift up and drop that back down. And so here, I'm going to take another piece of fabric, and on this piece, I've actually finished both the top and the bottom, because one of the other ways that you can bring your fabric in is to have it come all the way up to this edge here, which will allow you to make your gathers, or your tucks in this instance, a set amount down from the edge so that this could actually be top stitched in place. And this time, this is going to take one tuck every 6 stitches. And so you'll want to manage your fabric. And so this is a place where I would say you might want to keep a little stiletto close by. So this is even going in a little bit evener. And that's happening here because of the fact that I'm coming in a certain distance. Let's take that out and look at it. So that's a much looser look. And again, this can be top stitched down in place. Now, the other thing that I really like to do is to pleat grosgrain ribbon. And so here I have a piece of ribbon, and this time I'm going to do this every 12 stitches so that you can see what that looks like. And this time, again, I'm just going to use my little self-guiding piece of metal here on the front in order to be able to get this closer to the edge of my fabric. So normally you might have to take a couple stitches so that you can get this in place. There we go. Now, at any time, You can always make an adjustment on the fly to change the way that your stitching is, so that this is an easy thing to make an adjustment to. So there you go. That's a beautifully pleated piece of ribbon, and you can actually set those pleats if you want by going to your iron. But this versatile foot works on all Baby Lock machines. Just remember, once you've set it for your machine, you'll never have to do that process again. The bias binder foot is a snap-on foot that creates a perfectly finished edge on garments or even small craft projects. To begin, I'm going to be using a piece of fabric that's about 1 inch wide. And as you probably already know, anytime there's an adjustment screw on the foot itself, that allows some movement of the foot. Let's take it to the machine and see how that works. So here, let's take a look at this foot. Now, just like any other type of bias binder foot, it's always a good idea to cut the edge of your fabric that you're going to introduce at a 45-degree angle. And as you can see by looking at this foot, when you start feeding the fabric in, it's going to start taking this 1 inch wide strip of fabric and it's going to self-fold that fabric to create a finished edge. Now, I always find it easiest to use a stiletto or a small tool to help aid in feeding the fabric through. And once I have it down at the bottom of the foot, this is traditionally where I'll just pull a little bit more fabric through and underneath the foot so I can see that everything's feeding well. So when you look as this fabric's coming through, it's turning under and in, both top and bottom. And actually what you can see is this cupping here as the fabric's coming through. And you want to ensure that that's happening before you place this underneath the foot of your machine. Now, the adjustments that we have available to us, this piece can move side to side so that I can get it positioned where I want in front of the needle. And ideally, I know that as it's coming through, I want to have that needle coming right on the farthest left side. And so let's just take a few stitches on the fabric as it's coming through by itself. And you can see that I'm right on the edge, but I'm just a little bit too much on the edge. So I'm going to use my stitch width to move my needle over just a tiny bit. And now that I have that there, let's start introducing the fabric that's going to be encased by this binding. And I'm going to do that by sliding this forward. And again, I like using my stiletto to feed this fabric in. And you'll probably want to raise your presser foot as well so that you can tuck this fabric down and it doesn't get caught on this metal piece before you start stitching. So once I've done that, I'm just going to start by taking a few stitches. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about my hand position. This hand's job is to move the fabric over so it goes all the way into that little part of the bias binder attachment. And this hand is going to lift the fabric just slightly so that it continues that curling process that it was doing. And now what I like to do is before I continue my project, I'm going to swing this fabric over and look at how it's catching right on the edge. It's doing it on both the top and the bottom. I'm very pleased with how that looks. And now we'll just finish this edge. Now, something that I will mention here is that to get started with this bias binder attachment, you're better off doing straight edges of fabric to begin with. but you can successfully go around curves. You just probably need to have a little experience under your belt first. One of my little secrets is that if you've done this well, you can actually make yourself some nice little ties that can be used if you're making baby bibs or you want to make some little straps for something. This is beautifully done, and here's the edge of my fabric. So this looks beautiful, and if you're looking for a foot like this, head to your local Baby Lock retailer. They're full of inspiration and other foot ideas. The hemmer foot is a foot that will turn your fabric under twice and finish it off with a beautiful straight stitch. You'd probably recognize this stitch as the way that they finish hems on formal wear, but this is something that can be done as well on your Baby Lock machine. Let's take this over and take a look at this foot a little more closely. If you look right down in the front, you'll notice that there's a curl. And on the bottom of the foot, you can see that you've got some space here and in the back, which will allow your fabric to curl underneath and be able to be stitched on. Now I'm going to start by just putting the foot on my machine, and then I'm going to grab my fabric, and I'm going to begin using this nice piece of very fluid fabric, much like you would want to be able to stitch on. Now there's something I want to say about this foot, and that is this. That this is one of those feet that you are going to probably not be successful with at first, but not to worry. Once you start understanding how the foot works and you've played around with it a little bit, you'll get better. So I've started a little bit in on my fabric, and I also have it so that there's just a tiny bit over to the right. Once I've lowered my needle, I'm going to lift the fabric up, and then I'm going to lower my foot back down again. So watch how I take the fabric here, and what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be forcing it to curl around. So I'm going to be lifting up here using the stylus only so you can see what I'm doing. Now I'm going to tell you that when you're working with this foot, the very first few inches or so of the fabric is not going to be beautiful. What I'm doing here is I'm going to be forcing the fabric in, and notice how the curling process is beginning. So here's a few things I want you to know. I want my fabric to go no farther than here, and I don't want it to go any farther over on the top than right here, and I'm starting to get a little heavy. So I'm going to pull back on my fabric, and I'm just going to start stitching slowly so you can watch the action of this foot. Now I'm going to pause for a moment because I have a whole lot of whiskers on my fabric, and that's because it's been abraded a little bit, and I'm going to use a pair of scissors. I'm going to trim that off because there is no way that that's going to tuck in enough that I don't see it. And so you'll want to have a pair of scissors close by if your fabric does the same thing. So I'm not going really fast, and I'm on a straight edge of fabric. Now as I get closer to the end, if you take your eyes off, you might, like I'm starting to get to the end of my piece of fabric and it wants to kind of get out of my grasp. So this is where I'm going to have to be very purposeful about not just relaxing how it's coming in. So sometimes it's the beginning couple inches and at the end, the last couple inches, that sometimes doesn't turn out really well. But let's take a look at this. That's absolutely beautiful, and it's a perfect finish. So places where I've used this foot and this technique really were sashes on a girl's dress, because if you make them extra long, you can just cut away whatever didn't turn out perfectly. But again, totally worth the effort of learning how to use it, and this does make something look absolutely beautiful. The edge joining foot may end up becoming as much of a favorite for you as it is for me once you see this foot in action and what you can do. Let's look at this anatomy of this foot. It has a piece of metal here that's black, so it contrasts nicely against the metal of the foot. And there's a flange that comes down at the bottom. And what this does is it gives you the ability to join two pieces of fabric together using a stitch that looks kind of fancy. And so you can think about maybe constructing blocks together if you like, if you're a quilt as you go piecer, or you can actually make some good use of scraps of batting. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go on over to the machine and I'll show you what I'm talking about. So let's slide the foot in place. And now what I'm going to do is take two pieces of fabric. Now I've already turned under the seam allowance on both of them because I really want to have a finished edge, because this is not so much to overcast it as it is to join them together. And when I lower my presser foot, I have one piece of fabric to the right, one to the left. I want to make sure that I've got the fabric underneath the needle so that I begin stitching on the fabric. And now I've selected a stitch that's going to have some movement. It's going to stitch both on the right and on the left side of my fabric, therefore just kind of like spanning the distance between the two. Now as I'm stitching, it's very simple. I'm just riding this flange down between the two fabrics and just kind of holding them together, making sure that they aren't overlapping. Now I love how simple this is. It holds them together and it really does a nice job with the decorative stitch. This would be a good place to use some thicker, more decorative threads. And also, if you want to have the bite be a little bit wider, you can always adjust your stitch width on your machine very simply. Now, one of the other things that makes this foot kind of versatile, I'm just going to go back to my regular center needle straight stitch. What you can see is that very simply, if I wanted to, you can also use this foot as a registration for doing some stitching. I'm going to actually choose a left needle straight stitch and watch how by using that flange on the foot, I can guide my fabric to get some beautiful top stitching. So this foot will allow you to have fabric on both sides, but the other benefit too is that it does give you the ability to space some stitching very easily on one side or the other of the foot. Now for my bonus, I think that one of the things that frustrates me the most as a quilter is that a lot of times I'll end up with small pieces of batting that I really can't do anything with. But I'm going to go back to that stitch that I had earlier, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually stitch that stitch again, because now if you have batting that you're not getting good use out of, merge them together so that your next project you've already got the right size of batting. Now what I love about this technique is that I can't feel any extra thickness here, which you don't want to feel when you're quilting. Again, once you've quilted through it, this batting's not going to move, but this is a wonderful way to be able to take advantage of a lot of scraps that you have. And after all, being efficient in your sewing room is one of the best parts about being your own creator. So whether you're joining fabrics together or using the edge stitching foot to be able to do top stitching, this is one versatile foot you want to make sure is in your sewing room. The overcasting foot is one of those feet that really do make the edges of your fabric look nice and so that the fabric doesn't ravel. So I have a couple different fabrics here that we're going to use this foot on, but the magic kind of happens with this piece of metal that's jutted out. This is what I would call like a stitch finger on a serger. See how it comes off the back? And what this does is it prevents the edges of the stitching from compressing on the fabric, therefore not puckering it and giving it a better finished edge. You also have a little flange that comes out in front, and you can see it can lift easily so it can accommodate fabrics that have a variety of thicknesses. What this will do is help guide the fabric. Now let's take this to the machine, because then I want to talk about what stitches we're going to use. Now the thing that's going to make this work is choosing the right stitch. So there's a number of stitches that might be relevant for overcasting, and I would recommend that if you select one that you test it out, but I've already tested out stitch number 18 and I know that it's going to do good for this piece of fabric. So I'm going to slide this underneath the machine, and I want to put my fabric far enough back that I'm actually starting with fabric fully underneath where the needle plate is, and I also want to make sure that the edge of my fabric is just touching that black flange. So let's stitch. So if you look closely down inside of the machine, you may notice, and if you can't see it on mine, you'll definitely see it on yours, that the stitches are coming over the top of that little stitch finger, and then they're sliding off as they get past. So this is definitely one of those stitches that you need to have go from front to back out of your machine. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. So now that I'm at the end of my fabric, if I cut my thread, just know that to pull it out, I need to go straight back, right? So here we go. Now I love the fact that this just wraps the edges of my fabric with just enough thread so that it's not going to start shredding on me. And so this is what I'm talking about. You can have fabric that after a little bit of time, you start having all this lifting, and then pretty soon everything's just a big mess. So it does a nice job on this velveteen, but it will also do a very nice job if you have denim. And today's denim, a lot of it has lycra in it, so it doesn't necessarily fray so much, but you do get a lot of this, especially when you've got this kind of bias striation on it. So let's just stitch down this. So today, when I'm finishing off the edges of fabric, I mostly turn to my Baby Lock serger, but if you're using a specialty color of fabric and you want to match the thread, sometimes it's a whole lot easier to turn to an overcasting stitch like this on your household sewing machine. The blind hem foot is probably a foot that anybody who has ever purchased something that was too long needs to use. And this foot has a nice ability to be able to finish off a hem with a very, very small stitch. Now I've used a contrasting thread here so that you can see the stitch, but just imagine that this is potentially the bottom of a pair of pants or the inside of a pair of pants or a skirt. And so let's look at the preparation that you need to do before you go to the machine. I have a piece of fabric here, and what I've done is I've turned it up the exact amount that I want my hem to be. And then what I've also done is I've taken and turned down about 1/4 inch of fabric, because what I want is to have a beautiful finished edge both on the inside and on the outside of my fabric. To do that, let's go to the machine and let me show you how this works. All of our Baby Lock machines have a couple different choices for blind hem stitching. This stitch, number 36, is for woven fabrics or fabrics that don't stretch. And if you were to be doing a blind stitch on fabrics that have lycra in it, you would choose number 37. I'm using number 36. I'm going to snap the foot on, and then let's talk a little bit about how to position your fabric for success. So part of this has to do with the swing of the needle. So when I look over at my stitch or watch how it's formed, what you're going to notice is that my needle is going to go over to the left and take a bite into the fabric. Let's see what that looks like. So when I've actually stitched this piece, I'm stitching it like this, right? So that bite that I'm talking about is just catching the very edge of the fabric, and the majority of the stitching is going to happen on this edge that I folded underneath. To do that and get it positioned well, I need to use this little screw that's here on the top of the foot in order to be able to move this piece of plastic in or out. Let me show you how that works. I'm going to take my fabric that I have already prepared and I'm going to fold it like this. Now I'll do it a couple times because this is where people really get to a place where they're like, do that again. So here we go. We've got our hems in place, and I'm going to take my fabric and I'm going to flip it over to the opposite side, and then what I'm going to do is lift it up so that I have just that piece exposed. So here we go again. Fabric is tipped up. I'm just going to drop it back on itself and just have a little bit of the fabric exposed that I had turned under for my finished edge. That's how you begin. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my fabric and put it underneath the foot, and I'm placing this folded edge against this little plastic piece. Now when I select my stitch, and I'm touching number 36 one more time, when I select the stitch, my needle is going to swing to the starting position, and this starting position is actually the farthest left position. So what you can do next is start to lower your presser foot. And if you notice that it's taking a bigger bite in your fabric, all you have to do is raise the foot, and by adjusting this screw in or out, I'm going to hold this kind of still. Notice how it's moving the flange over to the left when I rotate it away from me, and it's going to come over to the right when I rotate it towards me. The way that I like to position it is I like to lower my presser foot so that I have my needle exactly where I want it to go, which is just a tiny bite into the fabric. And then what I like to do then is I like to move my plastic piece so that it comes right up to the edge. Now everybody holds their fabric just a little bit differently, and it's only by doing a test piece of fabric first that you're going to understand how closely you push this against the edge and how much on the edge your needle's going to go. So let's start stitching. I don't know about you, but I noticed that when I first started, I heard a little bit of a thump as my needle went into the left side of my fabric, and then that sound disappeared. What that's telling me is that I'm not getting a big enough bite into the fabric, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to back away on this plastic piece so that I can scoot my fabric in a little bit farther. Now see if you can listen for that little thump. Can you hear it? That means that it's going through more layers than it was before, and definitely more layers than just right here. And that means that it sounds like it's working the way I want it to. All right, so let's take a peek. I'm catching here, and look, I only missed it just a tiny bit up here at the top. Right? So that's what I meant by I missed that sound. And when I reassessed it, it did a better job. Now when I flip this back on itself, now I'm going to be able to see that even though I had white thread, it is very invisible here because I missed it, but I picked back up again, and as I went through, it did the job just nicely. So if you were to match your thread to your fabric, this would truly be an invisible blind hem, which is exactly what the name of this foot is all about. The roller foot is a foot that has a lot of versatility. First, with its plastic nature, it's going to glide over fabrics like this vinyl very nicely. But what you'll also notice is that using something that's kind of sticky like this clear elastic and adding it to something, this is the kind of foot that will allow you to do that with relative ease. Let me take it to the sewing machine and let's explore this foot a little bit. So this foot is one that it's nice to have in your stash because you never know when it might come in really handy. So I'm going to snap it in place. And then let's get this piece of vinyl out. Now, one of the things that I've noticed, especially when you're working with fabric that has a tendency to stick to the foot, is that even on some feet that might seem to be able to go over it smoothly, like the Teflon foot, This foot actually allows you to stitch and meander a little bit better. So the way that I would consider this foot and its benefit with using it on fabric like this is if you were actually stitching 2 layers of fabric together and you were following a curve, and if you were looking to get a seam allowance that was consistent throughout, this foot is going to have a much better time navigating those curves simply because of the fact that it has this roller in front and it will just allow nice movement. So I think that's a big benefit. The next technique that I want to show is a little bit of inspiration for you is by showing how using some of this clear elastic, especially on a problem fabric like this velveteen, actually does a very nice job. So I'm going to slide this underneath. And I want to show you how easy it is to get this so that it's stitching down in place. Now I'm going to get this anchored first, and then what I'm going to do is give this a little bit of a tug. Now you know that if you do that, you want to be able to grasp your fabric in the back. Let me just kind of give it a little bit of a snug here. Now I can tell you from experience that being able to do something like this on this kind of fabric and have a foot feed it easily is definitely something that you're not going to see very often. And so I would just tell you that this roller foot has a lot of flexibility, and it's one that if you have it around, you'll probably find yourself grabbing it more often than not. Today's fabrics come in all different types of looks and feels, but sometimes sewing on them is not so easy. If you're challenged with working on some fabric that's vinyl in nature, you ought to take a look at the metal roller foot, because this foot really does give you a lot of ability to be able to be successful, especially when it comes to some beautiful top stitching like I have here. This little mark, in addition to these rollers that are all the way down across the bottom of this foot, is what makes this work so well. Let's take it over to the machine. If you've been sewing for a while, you probably know that a metal foot along with vinyl fabrics really can be a disastrous union, because it does not typically roll over the fabric. It normally clings, but because the bottom of this foot has a series of 6 different rollers, they allow that fabric to feed smoothly underneath. So I have some felt back vinyl that I've seamed together, and one of the things that I know is that to have a finished seam like this, you need to either press it, which you can't do because it's vinyl. What you need to do is get that fabric to lay well in one direction, and that's where this foot comes in. I'm going to slide this underneath and snap it on in place. And then having done that, I'm going to grab my fabric and place it underneath the foot in such a way that I am lining up this seam with this center mark right here. Now the other thing that I've done is I've chosen a straight stitch in a left needle position, and what this is going to do is I'm stitching down this fabric. It's going to actually help kind of guide the fabric so I get my top stitching exactly where I want it to go. Using these registration marks is a much better tool for getting alignment rather than looking at your needle. You just want to pull that fabric apart, exposing that seam. Cut the thread and take a little look at it. But isn't that beautiful? And when you use a contrasting thread like this white against the black, it really does show it off. And not only that, it's perfectly pressed to one side. The stitch guide foot has a series of notches across this arm, which allow you the opportunity to get perfect top stitching and seam allowances. When you use a seam guide, you can measure where your needle position is and then use the corresponding mark in order to be able to do exactly the precise stitching that you're looking for. Let's take this over to the machine. Every sewing project that you do normally comes with a recommended seam allowance. Most home decor projects are 1/2 inch, and garment sewing is 5/8 of an inch. So how can this foot make the job of perfect seaming easier? Let's start by taking the edge of our fabric and making a mark where the 5/8 of an inch seam allowance is. Now that I have that mark on my fabric, it'll be easy for me to bring my fabric over to my machine, and once I've lowered my presser foot, I can look very easily and see that this notch right here on my fabric corresponds with this 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, with my needle position being right on that seam. I'm going to lower my needle, and if you can see right here, this was my line. This is my 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. If your seam allowance is either more or less than that, all you have to do is choose a different line. Watch how easy this is. I'm just following and watching where my fabric falls in relation to the notch on the foot. That's a perfect 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now, you can use this foot also for doing some very nice top stitching. So once you finish stitching something on your fabric, you can use one of these lines in order to be able to get your top stitching exactly where you want it to go. I'm going to place my second notch right here on the seam of my fabric, and my needle is going to stitch over to the side. That's extremely consistent, but just know that if you want to do multiple rows, just line up a notch with a row of previous stitching and stitch another line. Look how beautiful that is. So for perfect top stitching and seam allowances, check out the Stitch Guide Foot from Baby Lock. This felling foot makes a really easy job of putting your fabrics together and encasing them completely. Let's take a peek at the bottom of this fabric. If you don't know what flat felled stitches are, look at jeans maybe that you wear. What it does is it gives you the ability to be able to join two pieces of fabric together, and it's just as beautiful on the inside as it is on the outside. So let's take a look at the foot and see how that helps aid making that stitching perfect. When you look at the bottom of the foot, you'll notice that there is a lift here in the bottom, which will allow your fabric to be folded and come through. And this little flange out in front of the foot is what guides the fabric as it's coming through. So I've taken a piece of fabric and I've seamed it together in a 5/8 of an inch hem. And the trick to this stitch and getting it to work well is by stitching first a 5/8 of an inch hem, and then what you want to do is you want to press that seam to one side, which I'm doing right now. And once you've pressed it to one side, what you're going to be doing is identifying the lower seam allowance, which here is on this side. And then what I need to do is take a pair of scissors, and I want to reduce just this piece of the fabric that's on the lower portion. I want to reduce that to about 1/4 of an inch. Now I find it's much easier for me if I extend that seam allowance so that there's no chance that I'm going to accidentally cut the fabric that's supposed to stay longer. So I'm just going to ride my scissors down here and kind of eyeball cutting off of 1/4 of an inch. I even ride my fingers down to make sure that I'm not accidentally grabbing any of that. All right, so that's step one. The second step comes when I take this top piece of fabric, that's actually the longer piece, and what I'm going to do now with that, cut that little bit of fabric, I'm going to take that fabric and I'm going to have it meet my previous stitching. And so I'm just going to take my iron and press this down, and it's already rolling over to the side. And you can probably tell where I'm headed next. Now that I've done that, I'm going to open my fabric up. And for this next pass, I'm just going to reinforce the fact that that's tucked down evenly. And I'm going to set that in place. All right? So now that I've got that all finished, it's time to go to the machine. So let's take a look at our foot. So most baby lock feet are snap-on, but this foot is one that comes with its own shank. And to begin to put this on, I'm going to remove the shank that's for the rest of my feet, and let's just slide that out of the way. And in its place, let's screw on that foot. Now you'll probably find that one of the easiest ways to do this is by reaching up and giving yourself that extra little bit of lift and then lowering that foot, and it forces that foot down in place to make it really easy to put the foot back in. And for those of you that have a high shank foot, put that S adapter on first before you introduce the felling foot to your machine, and then by using the advanced driver, you'll be able to quickly get it in place. So now that I have my felling foot in place, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to bring my fabric up to the machine. And I'm just going to finger press this little piece down a little bit more. Because what I'm going to be doing now is I'm going to introduce the fabric in such a way, and this is where my stiletto always comes in handy. What I'm going to do is I'm going to lower the presser foot, and then I'm going to lift this fabric up. So I've lifted this up and I'm putting this fabric underneath the foot. Now, it always feels a little bit messy to begin with, but what I'm going to be doing is riding this down the edge of this fabric, and this is going to help self-guide so that my stitching goes where I want it to go. Now, my needle position is set up for a straight stitch center needle position. I'm going to rotate my hand wheel towards me and just take a couple little stitches to ensure that that's going where I want it to go, and I think that it is. And now with my stiletto in front of me, I'm just going to hold this fabric down, and let's just stitch down on that edge. Now, I find that having a stiletto makes it easier for me to have confidence in the foot. And if you've got a presser foot lifter on your machine, this would be a good time too also, that you can just kind of allow the fabric to relax into place. So it sometimes helps if you just give your fabric a little bit of a lift as well. I do this technique quite often where you give your fabric a little bit of lift, and that's what helps kind of keep it in the channel. What you don't want to do is have that pucker up on you. So just take your time as you're going down, using a stiletto if you need to. And obviously, everybody has different projects in mind and different types of fabric. And if you look at the instruction sheet that comes with this foot, you'll notice that we don't recommend really strong heavyweight fabric. And once you've played around with the foot, you'll probably understand why. It's because this opening over here does not accommodate a lot of thickness. But again, I really think that this is the kind of finish that perhaps on the inside of a skirt that you're making, without having to overcast seams, you can really have something that builds a lot of longevity into what you've stitched. So think about French seaming a lot of times on really nice heirloom type garments. This is going to give you that same look, and it'll help self-guide it so that your stitching is right on the edge. It is beautiful. And so this foot, along with many other creative feet, can be found easily at your local Baby Lock retailer.